Our next mini session is Sexual Education for Youth with Disabilities, which is going to be led by Lehan Mackin. She's an assistant professor in the College of Nursing at the University of Iowa. She conducts research that seeks to examine and address disparities in reproductive and sexual health. Dr. Lehan Mackin's current research seeks to fill a gap by developing sexual education resources that consider both strength and socio-communicative needs of youth with Autism Spectrum Disorder. She also teaches undergraduate public health nursing and partners with organizations that serve youth with developmental and intellectual disabilities.
Awesome. Well, I'm very grateful to be here, and I appreciate you taking the time to come and listen. I'm hoping you don't want to, something I say may be helpful, or at least interesting is where I've set my bar, I guess. So I wasn't expecting the introduction, and so I was going to tell you a little bit about me. So my job as faculty involves teaching and doing research at the University of Iowa, and I teach undergraduate public health, and which has been fun because I've been able to use some of the relationships I've developed as part of my research to have students. And this is actually a group of my former students who spent some time with the folks at the Village Community, which is a day center and after-school program for adolescents and young adults with disabilities. And you'll probably hear a lot of familiar things from what Liz said. But I do this for a couple reasons. One, I think as young nurses that it's a good experience. I think that the hospital focus doesn't give these young women who are, for the most part, able-bodied, doesn't give them much exposure to persons with disabilities and what it is like to live with that disability, the challenges and the gifts. And so I think that's an important learning experience for them. But in turn, then they can provide, they do some basic things, like basic health education things, but they serve as peer models. So they're just about the same age as the people that in the community. And so I find that important. But, and I'm a real person, I have a family. And then those 5 young women, they're my research team. 2 of them are sitting out at the table there. They're amazing. And then, of course, I always have to work in a picture of my dog. This is Olive. And it's funny, so I've had 2 people now who have seen these slides, and they're like, the picture of the dog's bigger than any of the pictures up there. And I'm like, yeah, what's your point? So, I'll do that. All right, so a long time ago when Catherine asked me to come talk, I had to actually say what I was going to talk about. And so I had a couple goals, and one was that I just wanted to talk a little bit about the status of sex education for kids with disabilities. And my focus is on kids with autism, which can definitely be generalized, I hope, to a lot of developmental disabilities. And then another goal was that to try to convince you that sexual education is important for transition to adulthood, and then to also share with you a little bit of my research findings in this area. And the little icon was a reminder to me to tell you that although I talk a lot about autism, some of the information can definitely be carried across to other disabilities. So the other thing I wanted to do was make sure that I sort of shared, I work from sort of a set of assumptions, and I want those to be transparent. One of those is that it doesn't matter whether a person has a disability or not, they're going to have the same sort of sexual development as someone who doesn't have a disability. So they're going to have brain changes, they're going to go through puberty. In the majority of cases, that isn't going to stop them from having those experiences. The other thing is that sexual expression can be dependent on the level of disability and your ability to navigate the social world. But that doesn't mean that someone who has significant challenges in those areas doesn't have the capacity for sexual expression. The other thing I believe is that healthy sexuality is an important part of our lives, that it's innately part of being human, and that it's important to our overall health and our quality of life. And it should be considered the same as our, whether or not we're overweight, or whether or not we're eating all our vegetables. That healthy sexuality is just as important as those things. And so I think that everyone needs sexual education. So I was actually just talking to someone out in the hall here before I came in, and they're like, oh my gosh, you're talking about, sexuality. And I'm like, yeah, I think that's sometimes why I get these gigs, is because I'm willing to talk about sex in public. Maybe not necessarily that I have a specialized knowledge or skills to share, but I said, this is what I tell my students all the time, is that there are two experiences that are pretty much universal to everybody. So everyone dies, and almost everyone has sex. But those are the two things we don't talk about. We are a strange society. So I think that everyone should have sexual education, and that includes people with disabilities. But I also want to point out a couple of things that I think are unique to folks with developmental disabilities. So the first thing is that they're more likely to be abused. So Sosby is a researcher from Canada, and he's predicted that a person with a developmental disability, it is 90% of people with a developmental disability are going to experience some sort of abuse at some point in their lifetime. The other thing we know is that sexually transmitted infections and unintended pregnancy are increasing in persons with developmental disabilities. And there's an over-reliance on pornography for some folks in this population. The studies that have been published have more of young men who are on the autism spectrum. And, we can debate, the pros and cons of pornography. I think that's a different discussion for a different day. But, think about it. So you have trouble with social skills, and you're constantly in this environment where you're trying to understand the feedback that's being given to you. And so here you find something that allows you freedom of your sexual experience or expression, and there's no judgment there. So, again, we can argue whether or not that's positive or negative. It's occurring, and so we need to know, what are we going to do with that? And sometimes, though, it gets in the way of life. Some people become obsessive, compulsive about pornography. They don't show up for work. They don't show up for school because it consumes them. It gives them skewed perceptions of what sexuality is and what sexual relationships entail. So that's a contemporary issue that is relatively new. And then the other thing is that we're seeing more offenses being committed by persons with disabilities. And I would argue that most of the time I don't think that's due to any sort of malintent, but because they don't understand what's going on, or they've never had the modeling behavior that's required to know how to have a certain type of interaction. But I don't want to just focus on problem behaviors or the negative aspects of sexuality. I want to come back to promoting healthy sexuality and why that's important. So there are numerous studies, I listed just a few there, that when we've talked to people who have disabilities, they want relationships. They want to be able to have a romantic partner with the possibility of intimacy. A lot of times, though, they don't have the skills to be able to make that happen. But they want it to happen. They're not really different than anybody else in that way. So, and perhaps explaining the higher levels of unintended pregnancy and sexually transmitted infections is that now more than ever, we're seeing more persons with disabilities in schools, in workplaces, out in the community. And so that's a great thing, but what that also means is there's an increased chance of meeting somebody or interacting with somebody that could result in some sort of romantic or sexual interaction. And then, it's sort of the overall arching question is, should disability rights be inclusive of a right to a healthy sexuality? So I'm going to leave that as a rhetorical question. I certainly have my own opinions about that, but I'll let them go right now. So what I think though, well, first of all, I want to say that sex education isn't the end-all be-all of what needs to happen, but I believe it's the starting place, because I think you have to have information to be able to make decisions which are going to guide your behavior. And so that's how I see it, is this is sort of maybe a starting place, a place where I feel like I can make a difference. And so having that knowledge and skills to sort of navigate, so as Liz talked about the social behavior, but then throw sexuality in there, and it's, the complexity, increases tremendously. Also, it's been shown that if you give someone correct information, they're more than likely not to have the health problems or the risk to their health, or at least reduce those. They have more productive conversations with their healthcare providers about what's going on with their body that can perhaps prevent issues or treat any sort of issues early. Can promote self-advocacy. So the more information somebody has, the more likely they are to come forward and report abuse, or to be able to stand up for themselves and say, I don't want you to do that. Or, I really like you. Let's go on a date. It enhances those behaviors as well. And I'll talk a little bit about stigma that came up in one of my studies quite a bit, but also I think by giving people information that has the capacity to change their behavior may also change the culture, the sort of the myths and sort of marginalization of people with disabilities when you're talking about issues of sexuality. What we know now, though, so is despite, I can talk about how much people with disabilities need sex education, but they aren't really getting it. And reasons for that are numerous, but so with the adolescents that are part of my research, what I found out is, so oftentimes kids with autism, because of social skills issues, they don't necessarily have these large peer groups. And while maybe that's not the primary source of information we want our kids to have, it's still a source of information. So, there's, in neurotypical peer groups, there's often this informal discussion about sexual issues, and so there's at least exposure and a normalizing of some of the language. But that doesn't necessarily occur for kids with disabilities. The other thing is, because they have trouble with receptive, right, trying to interpret messages, they don't necessarily pick up on the same things that we see in popular media, so on TV or in music, in the same way that neurotypical kids do. So they miss out there as well. Then the last thing is, often kids with disabilities have educational needs. And what happens is, and I'm not saying this is right or wrong, I'm just saying that this is what happens, is because of their educational needs, those are prioritized higher than any sort of health class, or a class where they might receive sexual education. So they're opted out for one reason or another. And so, honestly, what ends up happening is parents become the primary sexual educators. And, we could also talk about who your models were for sexual education, right? I'm guessing your parents. And some of you maybe had amazing parents that were able to talk comprehensively about sex, but I think that's rare. But you're sort of it. So, and that's another thing that I've kept in mind as I've done my research projects. The other thing is, there's not a lot of resources out there specific to kids with disabilities, and less for kids on the autism spectrum because of that social skills component. There are resources out there for intellectual disabilities. It still, I think, is more based on resolving problem-based behavior, not necessarily promoting healthy sexuality. But there is information that's presented simply in a way that's understand. And there are some curriculums out there that I think are good and are a good starting place. But the problem with curriculums is they're very generalized, so they're not individual to whatever your child's needs may be. They require a trained facilitator. It's often in a group setting. And I don't know about you, but when you have an adolescent that you're trying to get to learn something, especially about sex, a group setting's not all that comfortable. So it may not be the best setting. And oftentimes, when you put your child in a class, an 8-week sex ed class or a social skills class, that costs money. So those were considerations going into my research as well, is that I really am looking to create something that is individual to the child and also is a resource for parents, but it's kind of something that you can do together. So I have 3 research projects. 2 I've completed and 1's in progress. So my very first study I did was with providers, and so I wanted to know, and I go ahead and do the next slide. I realized I used HCP and didn't explain what that was. So healthcare providers. So I wanted to know, like, when families went to their doctor, their psychologist, or their social worker, even their speech pathologist, and they said, I'd like information to teach my child sex education. I want to know what providers gave to these families. Well, it was interesting. So, first of all providers in the study said sex ed was the primary responsibility of the parent. We can talk about whether you agree with that or not. More than half of those providers didn't recommend any resources. They had no resources that they were able to recommend. And the other 50% had resources that they recommended, but what they were neurotypical kid resources, and they told the parent to read this and modify it for your child. Okay. None knew of any autism-specific resources, but there was one exception, and I always like to tell about this place Amazed Me. So this was a behavioral therapy center. It's a very comprehensive behavior therapy center, and they employed a sex therapist as part of their staff. And so it was part of their treatment plan, and the families had to agree that their child's sex education and sexuality would be a part of their care plan. And the sex therapist would integrate things. And they did like crazy things. So they used South Park as one example of inappropriate behavior. And then they used polyamory, which I never watched. It's, I guess, a show on Showtime. But it shows sexual relationships that have more equity than typical pornography has. So there was more equity in the relationships, and they were romantic relationships rather than otherwise. And so they would actually teach folks about sex using this video, and so, oh my. So I did have one case where it was not the norm. So the next people I wanted to talk to was parents. And I was like, all right, parents, so what do you think you need for your child with autism? And if we were to give you something, what would it look like? And so I'm not going to read, I have several parent quotes here, and I'm not going to read them all, just kind of mention sort of the major themes. But it was clear in this set of parents, there were 15 parents, that they also felt that sex education was their primary responsibility. And I think it makes sense. I think when you have a child with a disability, you're so involved in almost every aspect of their life that really teaching them about sex shouldn't really be any different, that you're going to be involved in that too. But a lot of parents were like, you know what, I'm willing to take this on, but I'd really like my doctor to be on board and help me and provide backup. I'd like the teachers to help out. You know, I'd like my psychologist to help out. So I thought that was important. Go ahead and go to the next. And this was interesting too, and it points to the hidden curriculum. But parents parents had these real concerns because of the disabilities that their child had. You know, and she was worried like her son was going to get beat up because, you know, he was unaware of the social rules. And she was a single parent, and so she was also concerned, I don't go in the men's bathroom with him. You know, he's 14. I can't go in there with him, so how does he learn these things? And so there was definitely some really interesting and poignant lessons to be learned. A lot of stigma. It was interesting, I thought, that the parents who had more affected children talked a lot about the stigma and trying to allow their child to be sexual. There was this one parent who I have a quote from. Her son was severely affected. He had no verbal communication and had a few gestures, like maybe 3 that he would use. So he was severely affected. And when he was a teenager, they had problems going out in public. He would masturbate in public, and you know, and she would see the reactions of people around them, and it hurt her deeply. And so she was definitely on a crusade to reduce, you know, not only help her son, but to reduce stigma. And she actually spent a lot of time with a storyboard. They actually taught him that you only masturbate in the bedroom, and these are the steps, this is what you do, this is the steps you go through, and was successful. She says it took a really long time, but it was successful. And what was interesting to me though, so obviously she thought she was happy for her child, but she thought that that was going to impact stigma, because she, you know, she was no longer going to be contributing. Go back with just one.
You've got about 10.
Okay, perfect. And so the other question we asked families was, all right, so what would it look like? What do you want? You know, if we were to give you resources, and it came up that it's very common, mobile device technology, so either smartphones or tablets are important for a lot of different things. And it's been, those kind of devices have been shown to help language skills, language development, and social skills. And so we were kind of like, oh, I think that could work for some sex education modules. And so they had a number of features that they wanted to see. They wanted it to be interactive and engaging, not a lot of noise, but a lot of visual stuff. They wanted immediate feedback for the person participating, and parents wanted a behind-the-scenes look, so that they could know how their child was performing. So we were like, those are all great ideas. But we couldn't quite get started on that until we found out, what do these kids know and what do they don't know? So this has taken a little bit longer than what I envisioned. I wanted it done quicker, but I developed what we're calling the ASK. It's the Assessment of Sexual Health Knowledge. And it's basically just a quiz. It covers all of the 7 domains that are listed in the National Sexuality Education Standards. And so it gives us an idea of where their gaps in knowledge are. And that's the study we're doing right now. And so once we determine what areas kids need most, then we can start building interventions. And I have 2 groups that I'm working with. So I have adolescents with and without autism. We're going to compare knowledge levels. So we're actually not only going to determine gaps in the kids with autism, but also how are they compared to their peers. And I think it's going to give us some good information about what kind of information they're getting from school or their peers. And I actually officially can't recruit for that study because I was hoping to have human subject approval prior to coming here. It's supposed to come any day, but it didn't happen before I got here. So we have information about the study, but I can't actively ask you to sign up and help. But it's an online survey. Everything's online. There's a parent component and a child component, and there's compensation for participating. I'm actually I have a partner that I'm working with, the University of Outreach Project, that is with young adults with different intellectual and developmental disabilities. And they started a new sex ed curriculum, and so we're doing pre and post tests to see what they're learning using this instrument that I've developed.
Amy, listen, we got 7 minutes total.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, I didn't realize, I thought you said 5 minutes left, but okay. All right, I want to make sure that you have enough time then. So let me just.
I can get it done in 5.
Do you want to go to this slide? So I just want to say that my goal here is to use science to sort of try and meet these unmet needs. So finding out what youth know and don't know, what are the needs for reducing risk, and what do parents think their youth need to know. So putting all those things together with the ultimate goal of developing this library of sex education modules accessible as apps. And people can choose by age, gender, level of disability, and even decide what fits within family values. And so that's my end game and my hope. But yeah, I have some resources that you can ask for, and then also some references if you're interested.
Okay, no need for introductions because that's going to slow things down. I'm Nathan Kirstein with Disability Rights Iowa, an attorney there. What do you need to know? There's a few parts of the law that I think are important for you all to know here today. One has to do with educational requirements. Alyssa talked a little bit about what would be good, and I'm going to tell you what the law requires, and that is that 1 unit of health education, which includes sexual health, is required in the state of Iowa for all students 9 through 12th grade. Okay? Also, the legislature has said that the school board shall provide age-appropriate and research-based instruction in human growth and development, which includes human sexuality. So, those 2 parts are requirements of our state standards for education, right? So, for kids on IEPs, that's no different. In fact, it's required as part of the definition of a free and appropriate public education under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. Now, there's a part in the Iowa Code that allows parents to decide whether or not their child will take that health class. So that's something for you all to know. Also, as part of the, I'm going to call it the IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. Part of the IDEA requires that at 14, if you're on an IEP, you start transition planning for post-secondary life in the areas of living, learning, and working. Okay? Why this is important and connects to what we're talking about here today in terms of sexual health is that is something that youth with disabilities should know just as much as youth without disabilities, correct? And can be a part of their transition goals in living, possibly learning. So something to think about there. Now, does that mean they participate in the gen ed curriculum exactly like another student that's a gen ed student? Maybe not. Maybe they do, depending on their disability, depending on what they need for supports and services. That should be decided by the IEP team and should be probably tied into their transition goals, at least starting at the age of 14. Why do they need to know this stuff? Because contrary to popular belief, once they reach the age of adulthood, the age of majority here in Iowa is 18. Once they reach that age, and if there is some type of belief that they need a guardianship, and you get a court order of guardianship, the guardian does not have any say on who they associate with, whether or not they have sex with who and where and what and when. That's not the guardian's right. That remains the ward's right. It's a constitutional right of freedom of association. And that's been upheld by the courts many a time. So it's something for you all to know. So how do you educate someone that might be more vulnerable towards being taken advantage of? One would be starting early, speaking to their individual need level. Melissa had some great ideas, I think, that are going to come out of her research as well. And it's something to think about, and it's not only something to think about, it's also really their constitutional right as an adult when they become an adult, and it's their right as a student covered under the IDEA. So those are 2 very important things, and we have 2 more minutes, and I want you to know that, okay, so are there any protections? Is there any special laws for individuals with disabilities that somewhat govern the area of sexuality, sexual acts, things like that, right? The only one that I'm going to talk about really is criminal law. We have criminal law in Iowa. It varies from state to state. A lot of states have sexual abuse statutes, right? And in that statute in Iowa, if a person performs a sex act with someone not cohabitating as husband and wife, and the other person is suffering from a mental defect or incapacity which precludes giving consent, then that person can be found guilty of sexual abuse in the third degree. Well, there's some questions. What does, what is capacity? Okay, and the courts in Iowa have helped us out with that. And with a lot of language that I'm not going to read, we don't have time, but the main issue you need to know is whether or not the mental strength of the victim is so far below the normal that it precludes effective resistance. Keeps a person from being able to resist, or even have knowledge that they can resist. The other part of this I'll say in terms of our, what I'm talking about right now would be fallen under kind of the common way of saying statutory rape laws, right? The other part of that has to do with age. It has to do with everything. You can't engage in a sexual act in Iowa with someone under the age of 12. That's everything. Then there's age limitations on how much older the person can be as the person is a teenager. Those apply to everybody. So there's only one real criminal protection that applies to people with disabilities, and that applies to youth and adults. So, and that doesn't guarantee it's not going to happen. And, we don't have that in our society. What we do is we guarantee punishment for the perpetrator, right? And so that's what that essentially does. But other than that, a guardianship, later on in life as an adult is not going to guarantee that that person is not going to be taken advantage of. It's not going to guarantee that you as a parent or anyone else that takes on the guardianship role has any say in what that person does to engage their own sexual being and sexual acts. So that's a nutshell of the law in 5-6 minutes. So if you have questions, I'll be here after this.